Good morning. First of all, thanks to all you for attending this meeting. And thanks also to the Association of the Study on the Middle East and Africa for offering us this opportunity to speak about an issue that attracts our attention. That is the origins of the Islamic religion, and more concretely, the question of a potential link between early Islam and Jewish Christianity. That's to say, Christians that maintained or adopt certain Jewish beliefs and practices, either Jews that believe in the Messianism and or the prophecy of Jesus, groups whose existence and nature is still a matter of debate. We have organized this meeting in 3 panels. This one with Dr. Shoemaker, Dr. Hoyland, and I. The second one this afternoon with Dr. Die and Dr. Mimouni, and tomorrow morning Dr. Zelentin and Dr. Segovia. As you will realize, there are different and even opposing views on this point. And this is good because the debate is assured. And I think, in my opinion, it's better to debate a question without solving it than solving a question without debating it. Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Dr. Samir.
I'm just presenting the three one by one. Once again, the argument is Jewish Christianity and the origin of Islam, part 1. And we will have part 2 and 3. And now we have the first one who speaks is Professor Francisco del Rio Sanchez from the University of Barcelona. His argument is Jewish Christianity and Islamic origins, the transformation of a peripheral religious movement. Professor del Rio Sanchez is Associate Professor of Semitic Languages at the University of Barcelona in Spain or in Catalonia. Not yet. The study of connections between the languages, cultures, and religions in the Near East is at the core of the training and academic production. He has collaborated in different projects related to Bible, to Semitic languages, and to archaeology of the Middle East, working in Aleppo, Syria, from 1998 to 2011, 13 years. Since 2005, he is in charge of a project centered on the study of Arabic and Syriac manuscripts of northern Syria. And he published already some description of manuscripts, catalogs. Since 2012, he has led the Spanish team within a European project on the study of Nabatean inscriptions.
Among all the different theories that currently explore the religious milieu of late antiquity to elucidate the origins of the Islamic religion, I refer to those that revive the question of a potential link between early Islam and Jewish Christianity. That's to say, Christians that maintained or adopt certain Jewish beliefs and practices, either Jews that believe in the Messianism and or the prophecy of Jesus. The arguments defending the existence of a Jewish Christian foundation in early Islam are of unequal value. And the advocates of this theory adopt different positions on the same subject. The most maximalist claims that embryonic Islam was only but a certain kind of local Jewish Christianity, possibly a peripheral religious movement, which developed into a differentiated religion for various reasons. Other moderate proposals recognize the existence of Jewish Christian influences of the Qu'ran, but they value differently the importance of those within the text. In fact, many data have been taken in consideration by different researchers, as is the case of the late Patricia Qu'ran, who concluded that Jewish Christians were the most obvious candidates for the role of transmitters of a number of Quranic themes. Other scholars accept a possible presence in Arabia of Jewish Christian groups, or accept the basic claim of Jewish Christian influence on early Islam as a reasonable possibility. The theory was proposed for the first time by John Toland in the beginning of the 18th century. Almost 2 centuries later, Harnack reformulated the same idea with more contemporary terms, a thesis that would be taken up by Schletter and especially by Sheps. The same data would be re-examined in the works of Thor Andrae, or more recently Roncaglia, among many others. Little more could be said in this regard using the method of establishing parallels between the Qu'ran and what could be known of early Jewish Christianity, and therefore the issue was more or less settled. Nevertheless, some works based on the linguistic analysis and the reinterpretation of the source began to appear during the last third of the 20th century, paving the way for a second generation of studies. Without losing sight of one's revolutionary suggestions, the first substantial turning point of this theory would be the proposal of Günther Lülling, for whom Islam in its origins would be related to a kind of marginal Christianity which had its last refuge in Arabia. In fact, Lülling suggests that Muhammad, a member of one anti-Trinitarian Christian community, inaugurated a strong monotheistic movement aiming to bring together Jewish and Jewish Christians against the idolatrous Trinitarians. Other authors pertaining to this second generation of researchers would raise again a Jewish-Christian connection for the Islamic origins. Yehuda Nevo argued that the religious formulae of the first Islamic inscriptions found in the Negev suggested an indeterminate monotheism that gradually progresses towards what later came to be known as Islam. Nevo, taking inspiration from Wandsworth's hypothesis, postulates that Islam was born in an environment where the vast majority of people were pagan, while the elite professed a certain kind of Jewish Christianity. On the other hand, Shlomo Pines defends the survival of Jewish Christianity into Islamic times on the basis of the information conserved in the Tathbit of Abd al-Jabbar and in the Hal al-Shukuk by Ibn Aun. Pines was convinced that these texts contain Judeo-Christian traditions, suggesting that Islam should be understood as a development of Jewish Christianity. The theories of François de Blois could be placed within in this second generation of studies. According to him, the Islamic religion exhibits important similarities with Manichaeism due to the common Jewish-Christian background of both religions. According to de Blois, Islam in its origins was a peripheral product in the religious life of the Near East. This early Islam had been in contact with fossils of marginal character, just like Nazorean Judeo-Christianity. Nilka also defends the presence of Nazorean communities in the early Islamic environment, and according to him, this fact might explain the close parallels between Islamic and Jewish Christian theologies. The current generation of studies, represented by authors such as Holger Zellentin, among others, stands for an interdisciplinary approach that continues to suggest a rapport between Jewish Christianity and early Islam, but now takes a more cautious approach. Firstly, they propose a reformulation of the term Jewish Christianity and its interpretation. On the other hand, and from the current historical perspective, this new line of research is not overly centered on linguistic analysis of lexical comparatives, but it gives more attention to the study of affinities between the Quran and the Christian literature, possibly originating in a Jewish Christian milieu. In any case, the future of this line of the research involves finding a satisfactory answer to 3 major questions related to the existence of a Jewish Christian influence on early Islam. Firstly, the problem of historicity, that is, how to demonstrate the continued existence of Jewish Christian communities within the early 7th century Hijaz in order to explain the ways through which this concept may have reached nascent Islam. Intrinsically linked to this first issue is the terminological problem, namely the rethinking of the use and meaning of the term Jewish Christian. Finally, it is necessary to determine if the influence of Jewish Christianity reaches the same ideological structuring of Islam as it is present in the Quran, or it is only possible to identify some common isolated theological ideas. There is a strong objection to the existence of real influences of Jewish Christianity on Islam, namely the allusion to the lack of geographic or chronological proximity between both religious phenomena. This observation is based upon the assumption that Jewish Christianity disappeared probably after the 2nd century and certainly during the 4th century, and therefore it is not viable to explain neither the precise origin and nor the channels through which those ideas reached the 7th century Hijaz. From this perspective, it is possible to recognize in the Quran some common theologumena, but they would be little more than interesting and probably useless phenomenological coincidences. The scholars engaged in the study on early Islam usually accept at this point the most common historiographical opinion regarding Jewish Christianity, which at the said time depends on the version of the facts provided by Eusebius of Caesarea. According to Eusebius, Jewish Christianity, a denomination never used by this author or by any other Christian writer from the patristic period, was a religious movement that ended during the 2nd century with a diminishing trajectory after the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70. From this perspective, it's impossible to establish any link between this first Jewish Christianity and those supposed Quranic Jewish Christians appearing from nowhere at least 3 centuries later. The authors holding this conclusion argue with no small amount of reason that the rabbinical works barely mention this issue, and the Christian sources offer unreliable information regarding Jewish Christians because of their ambiguity, their intentionality, and their dependence on other sources. At this point, it is necessary to work on the question from 2 different aspects: a reformulation of the meaning of the concept Jewish Christianity, and from this starting point, a new approach to the information provided by the sources. As noted above, it is well known that Jewish Christianity and its related terms is a modern category that continues to be used with the same contradictory meanings attributed to it by Eusebius, because 1. It serves to name the Orthodox movement of Jews who followed Jesus in the early church of Jerusalem, but also it is used to group certain heresies listed in the patristic works into a single category. This is precisely what has caused Jewish Christianity to continue to be studied along these 2 lines, in spite of the fact that the concept thus expressed has nothing to do with the reality of the facts and therefore is unsuitable for his correct description. In any case, and lacking a better one, the composite word Jewish Christianity continues to be useful to refer to the common denominators of our extremely complex religious phenomenon that might well have continued to exist in many places of the Near East, including 7th century Arabia. The proposal for a redefinition of Jewish Christianity has been ongoing since at least 1998. As a result, there is a greater agreement to accept that under this denomination we should include the multiple Jewish ways of belief and worship that continue to persist or were created thanks not only to the evolution of the original Christianity of Jewish origins, but also to the continuous contact between Jews and Christians, a circumstance which caused new and different Judaizer Christianities. Jewish Christianity, far from diminishing after the catastrophe of the year 70, was emerging in different ways and forms an habitual strand, especially within the Syriac, Ethiopic, and Arabic Christianity, adopting the appearance of a complicated patchwork formed by different phenomena of unequal origins and nature, from which we do find clues and even proof that still needs to be further examined. Even from a traditional perspective, the influence of the synagogal Judaism in the origins of biblical, theological, and liturgical tradition of Syriac Christianity, especially the Eastern branch, is a fact commonly accepted. It would be imprecise, inaccurate, and even deceptive to qualify this branch of Christianity as Jewish Christian. However, it is true that Jewish Christianity would have been a vital element of Syriac Christianity during the 3rd and 4th centuries, as witnessed by the works of Badaisan, Afrahat, or Mani. Even the book of El-Kasai, as Stanley Jones suggests, should not be considered as a Christian aberration, but a founding document of early Syriac Christianity in Mesopotamia and Syria. The same could be said of that literature close to the Jewish Christian views, such as the Pseudo-Clementine writings or the Didascalia. Sidney Griffith himself says that the text of Jewish Christian inspiration, coming from the Syriac tradition, continued to be of interest and importance for the Christians of late antiquity. In my view, the profile of those Christians could be detected thanks to some testimonies belonging to the 4th, 3rd, 8th centuries. As Patricia Qu'ran notes, the presence of Judaizer Christians in Syria, Mesopotamia, and Phrygia during the 4th through 7th centuries is a well-known fact, but it has significant implication in understanding the oldest Islamic documentation, because Muslim and Jewish Christian could argue that they were the true followers of Jesus' teachings, creating an alliance against the corruption provoked by the introduction of Roman customs. On the other hand, the testimonies about a likely presence of Jewish Christians in Palestine, Transjordan, and even in Arabia deserve a careful consideration. Finally, the Ethiopic influence of the Qu'ran has been recognized for a long time, especially from the perspective of the comparative lexicography. Even so, the studies of the possible theological influence from the Ethiopic side on early Islam traditionally remained vague and rare. In the light of our approach, the presence alongside nascent Islam of a Christian tradition, strongly influenced by Judaism, has raised enormous interest from some researchers. Guy Stromsa has proposed applying a principle of non-exclusivity to identify the sources of early Islam, making explicit reference to the question of Jewish-Christian influence on this religion, and warning of the risk of oversimplifying reality. In this same context, Stromsa states that there are two circumstances that impede the determination of the Jewish-Christian origin of some Quranic terms and formulae: the sparse evidence of a movement such as in the area, and the lack of knowledge of the mechanism through which Jewish-Christian ideas were transmitted. In my view, an equidistant position is valid if we regard early Islam as a cluster formed by isolated contributions. But I prefer to understand the Quranic theological system as the sedimentation of different contributions of unequal value, which ended up forming a coherent unit despite the inner contradictions, thanks to the hermeneutic reading of the holy text. In this sedimentation, could be possible to identify, first, the oldest elements, namely those characteristics of the primitive belief that led to a fully differentiated religion. Second, the elements making up structured notions added to that original stratum, and other contributions of unequal value. What does seem likely is that the oldest ideological stratum in the Quran presents a monotheistic faith of apocalyptic nature with some local features allusively formulated which presupposed the knowledge of Christian and extra-biblical traditions by the audience. A characteristic feature of this foundational faith is the conception of prophecy that, united together with its peculiar Christology, forms a typically, in my opinion, Jewish Christian system. The key element of all the proto-Islamic argumentation is the conception of prophecy very similar to the Jewish-Christian conception, almost in three aspects. One, the reproduction of a history in which the main axis is formed by the figures of Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. Second, the lack of progress in the revelation, that is to say, a revelation without innovation, in which the Holy Scriptures are merely a repetition of a single message. And third, the role of Muhammad as a copy of the Jewish-Christian Jesus role. In this conception of prophecy, the figure of Jesus is treated in a particular way, with a characterization which is different to that adopted by other prophets, including Muhammad. As Gerard Houghton recently showed, the characteristic of the Quranic Jesus and the specific significance of his titles in the narrative context of the Holy Book, his identification with Adam and his vaguely angelic and celestial characters, set up a Christology that leads us in the direction of Gnostic Jewish-Christian groups. I'd like to finish saying something. In historical and philological research, the value of the information provided by the sources frequently depends on how researchers select, analyze, and interpret it. This principle acquires even more relevance in the current studies on early Islam and its origins, in which is in vogue to take absence of evidence as evidence of absence, as Hoyland said. Such ambiguity and even arbitrariness in the choice and interpretation of the data is probably due to the impossibility of separating humanistic study for the patient's interests, expectations, and even political circumstances underlying the same defended theories. As already has been noted by other authors, the situation has been made worse by political events in USA, Europe, and the Near East after the Twin Towers attacks, pushing scholars into being involuntarily anti-Muslim propagandists, in the case of revisionists, or apologists for it, in the case of traditionalists. In this context, the proposal for a Jewish-Christian influence on nascent Islam has been even qualified as a Zionist theory. It's difficult to specify if the Quran was influenced and to what extent by Jewish Christianity, and if it really depends on this religious movement. In any case, this question reveals that we know much less about the origins of Islam than about those of Christianity and Judaism, despite the epistemological optimism which has traditionally marked the modern and contemporary historical research focused on Muhammad and the beginnings of Islam. Fortunately, there is still much to be done in this field, and perhaps the same Quranic test may be the strongest evidence for those seeking traces of Jewish Christian communities during the late antiquity. Thank you very much.
Now, the word is to Professor Robert Hoyland from New York University. The argument, the Judeo-Christian audience of the Quran. Robert Hoyland studied Oriental Studies at Oxford University when he wrote his doctoral thesis on non-Muslim accounts of the rise of Islam. The emergence of Islamic civilization has remained a key focus of his research and is the subject of his latest book, In God's Path, the Arab Conquest and the Creation of an Islamic Empire. In addition, Professor Hoyland's interest in archaeology has led him to participate in excavations in Syria, Yemen, Israel, Palestine, and Turkey, Kurdistan. He is currently involved in the excavation of the city of Partavi Barda in modern Azerbaijan, which was the capital of the Christian kingdom of Caucasian Albania and the site of the first Muslim garrison in eastern Caucasus. Professor Hoyland, you have the word.
Thank you very much. So I've just done a very brief PowerPoint so that you can see a couple of the key texts that are relevant. I've slightly changed the title by putting quotation marks round Judeo-Christian, and that's because those of us on this panel have had time to read each other's papers, and all the other participants strongly warned against the dangers of using this term Judeo-Christian. So I've taken them seriously, and I can say it's not really my expression, Judeo-Christian. The reason I use it at all, besides the fact that actually the panel was meant to be about Jewish-Christian environment for the Qu'ran, is that my primary interest is the audience of the Qu'ran. The Qu'ran assumes that its audience are very familiar with a lot of Jewish and Christian stories, scriptural material. How is that so? How are we meant to envisage that? Is it that a lot of material is circulating orally from different sources, Jewish sources, Christian sources, and they happen to be fully aware of both of them? Are they combined? Is it actually a more Judeo-Christian, just in the sense that the Jewish and Christian traditions have become more merged in West Arabia? It's difficult to say. So this is the beginning of a kind of exploration of this question about the audience of the Qu'ran. The quotation, I quite like the match between Quran 2255 and Psalms 1214, and you'll see as the talk progresses why that's relevant. Ever since Torrey and Bell, scholars have sought to demonstrate Jewish and Christian influence upon the content of the Quran. This influence is evident not only in its stories about Old and New Testament figures, but also in many of its legal and ritual prescriptions. Moreover, the Quran recounts some stories in a very elusive and elliptical manner, and one can't really discern their import if one doesn't know the Jewish or Christian counterpart to which they allude. So as I said, does that mean the audience is acquainted with both traditions? If so, would this imply that they were Judeo-Christians of some sort? Or was West Arabia exposed to both Jewish and Christian teachings to a much greater extent than has usually been supposed? Or else should we infer that we only have the Quran in an abbreviated form, and that Muhammad related these accounts, at least on some occasions, in a much fuller form? Let me give an example of what I mean before I continue this line of thinking. I'll give you a very simple one first. This is the story of how Mary, mother of Jesus, was given sustenance by a palm tree. Jesus calls to Mary from below her, "Don't be sad, your Lord has put below you a rivulet." Although the mention of a rivulet is not immediately comprehensible here, the Quran is clearly influenced by the tale in the Christian tradition of how Mary, tired on the journey to Egypt, seeks rest under a palm tree, whereupon Jesus, looking up from his mother's bosom, as it says in the Christian text, calls upon the palm tree to lower its fruit-bearing branches and to let a stream come out from under it, and thus Mary is able to eat and drink. So it's kind of doubly interesting for my point. One, it's alluding to Christian tradition, not the kind of standard gospel material, but part of wider narrative circulating about the life of Jesus. And it does so in such a manner that really, for it to make sense to its audience had to know that tradition. Most of the narratives from the Quran concern Old Testament characters, and for that reason it's been assumed, at least since Torrey, that Muhammad was much more influenced by Judaism than by Christianity. However, many of the Old Testament narratives in the Quran are closer to versions found in late antique Christian commentaries and homilies than in the Old Testament narrative itself, or in late antique rabbinic works. This has recently been demonstrated by Witztum in his PhD at Princeton in connection with Quranic tales about Satan refusing to bow before Adam, Cain and Abel, and Abraham's building of the Kaaba, and Joseph's relationship with Potiphar's wife. Here I'd like to present the interesting example of the anonymous sleeper of Quran 2259. So I'll give a brief explanation of this narrative and then return to that question about what this tells us about both the Quran and the environment in which it grew up and its audience were enmeshed. It's a single verse alluding to someone who passes by a place which is ruined because he's seen to imply that even God isn't capable of reviving it. He's punished by being put to sleep, he thinks for a short time, whereas in reality it's a long time. This verse was used by Luxembourg in trying to rationalize it, because it seems to not make any sense. Why, if he's slept for a very, very long time, has his food and drink not gone off? And he tries to refashion it into Syriac. But actually, if you understand the background, what it actually is alluding to, then it becomes clear why the food and drink had not gone off. No further information is given in the Qu'ran as to the identity of either the township or the person. The majority of Muslim commentators were agreed that the former was Jerusalem, but they were divided over whether the person was Jeremiah or Ezra. Both of these prophets were connected by the writings attributed to them with the sack of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BC. Yet in the works of Jewish and Christian exegetes, neither was known to have undergone a lengthy period of sleep. This honour went to the Ethiopian Abimelech, the faithful servant of Jeremiah, who asked God to reward his servant for his loyal service. He twice freed his master from imprisonment by sparing him the destruction of Jerusalem. Though this character is known in the Jewish tradition, it's the story told by a Greek Christian apocryphal text known as For Baruch, or the things omitted from Jeremiah, that seems closest to the Quranic narrative. Just before the siege of the holy city commenced, Abimelech was sent by Jeremiah to collect some figs to give to the sick, and having picked a few and put them in his basket, he lay down under a tree to rest. God, respecting the promise he'd made to Jeremiah, put Abimelech to sleep for 66 years. When Abimelech awakes, he assumes that, like the man of Qu'ran 2259, and also in the other narrative in the Qu'ran that concerns long sleep, namely the companions of the cave, he assumes that he's only slept for a little while, a day or part of a day. He goes off to Jerusalem, but he's confused by the changed appearance of the city. He asks an old man about the whereabouts of Jeremiah, who tells him that the prophet is now in captivity in Babylon with much of Jerusalem's Jewish population. Abimelech is confused and says, but not enough time has elapsed for all this to have happened. And he remarks upon the freshness of his figs to confirm how little time can have gone by. But the old man points to the fields, observing that the crops have not yet matured and figs are not yet in season. So hence the point in the Qu'ran why his food hasn't gone off and why it's significant. The figs serve the same in stories about people sleeping for a long time. When they wake, initially they think they've only slept a little time, but then something gives it away and they realize, aha, and they realize they're in an anachronism effectively. In the story about the sleepers in the cave, one of them is sent out to buy some food, but he uses money that's 300 odd years out of date, and the people in the market say, what's this? What's this money? It belongs to a pagan emperor, so it's not even used anymore. And so that the coin is this significance and alerts the person to the fact that they're out of time. And the same here, the figs serve that same purpose. And they make clear to their owners that their sleep must have been for a lot longer. Abimelech is taken next in the Christian account by an angel of the Lord to see Baruch, Jeremiah's scribe, who on seeing the figs proclaims, "Look at the basket of figs, for behold, they are 66 years old, and they have not become shriveled or gone bad, but they're dripping milky juice." The exact point in the Qu'ran, they have not gone off, they still are fresh. The figs dripping with milky juice echo the food and drink of Qu'ran 2259, as indeed was realized by Muslim commentators, who explain the words in the Qu'ran as a reference to fruits and their juice, even though they attribute them to Jeremiah rather than Abimelech. The same observation, they haven't gone bad, is found in both the Christian Baruch text and in the Qu'ran. And the point of the statement is now clear. The figs are fresh, and it's not their season, which occasions a moment of what in literature you would call an anorisis, a sudden realization of the truth about the situation. Though For Baruch is set in the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, it's an early Christian text, and one that emphasizes the idea of the resurrection. The verb used for Abimelech's sleep and awakening anaparsis, and exipnizin allude to the sleep of death and the entry into eternal life. The ripe flesh and juice of the figs symbolizes the fleshly home, the dwelling place of the soul, which shall not rot, but will be reserved for the bodily resurrection promised to the righteousness. Bodily resurrection is also a major theme in the Qu'ran, and it links the stories of the companions of the cave and the subject of verse 2259. In both cases, the sleepers are put to sleep and roused from it directly by God. The verb for the latter action is ba'atha, used for resurrection. In both cases too, the sleepers are asked how long they remained, kam labithtom in Arabic. And the same question is, according to Quran 23:113, put to the souls of the departed lined up on Judgment Day, meaning how long had they remained on the earth. In all three cases, the answer is the same, a day or a part of a day, yawman aw ba'da yawmin. Though it's a common perception of long sleepers that they have only dozed a brief while, as for example in the tale of Abimelech above, also in the Greek myth of Epimenides, who sleeps for 57 years in a cave in Crete. Same on home soil here, Rip Van Winkle. There's an interesting link between Rip Van Winkle and the tale of Abimelech. It's for Rip Van Winkle, he's spared having to watch the ravages of the civil war, whereas for Abimelech, he's spared having to watch the destruction of Jerusalem. These parallels again reinforce the link between sleep and death, and between death and resurrection, and also buttresses the Quran's teaching of the bodily resurrection. The second and last element of the story of verse 2259 is the man's donkey. So in the tale, as we say, it also tells not just look at your food and drink, it hasn't gone off, but look at your donkey and look at the bones and how they've been revived. One could explain this away. Christoph Luxemburg decides to replace the Arabic word for donkey, hemar, with the Syriac word for perfection, gamara. You don't actually even need to turn to Syriac for this reinterpretation. The Arabic root underlying the word donkey conveys the sense of redness, ruddiness, and one could stretch this to healthiness. Both the Syriac perfection and the Arabic ruddiness, healthiness would fit well with the remaining portion of the Quranic verse, which speaks of rejuvenation, the reknitting of the bones, and reclothing with flesh, an allusion to Ezekiel's vision of how God spoke to dry bones. Or you could say that it draws on other similar tales. For example, the Talmudic tale of the enigmatic Honi the Circle Drawer, a holy man, a miracle worker of the 1st century BC, who fell asleep for 70 years, and upon waking saw that his donkey was still alive, and had sired many offspring. But it perhaps makes better sense to regard the donkey as a narrative elaboration that took place in the Arabic-speaking monotheist circles of West Arabia. The same goes perhaps for the dog, who acts as a guardian in the tales of the companions of the cave. And this is an interesting point. Not only does the Quran assume that its audience knows these biblical tales, but what is more, it's alluding to different versions of these tales than are known to us from mainstream Jewish and Christian texts. So I should get back to my earlier point. So we can see that this tale does clearly allude, anyway, to the late antique Christian tale in what's called 4 Baruch. But how was this material transmitted to Muhammad's Arabia? Witztum, in his PhD, focuses on the similarities between the texts and doesn't really go into the mechanics of how the Quran drew upon Syriac Christianity. Sidney Griffith has thought about this process, and he argues that Syriac Christianity was disseminated orally to Arabophone Christians in Arabic. This tends to be, give a few other people, it tends to be the most common assumption of how material is transmitted, generally orally. However, we could assume that Arabophone Christians were the same as Christians of other language traditions, and assume that texts were translated into Arabic by missionaries, and a script devised for that purpose, just as happened, for example, for Georgian, Armenian, Coptic, Christian Palestinian, Aramaic speakers, and so on, in the course of the 4th to 6th centuries. That is, there could have been a Bible, or at least various Christian texts already written in Arabic before Muhammad. This would then make sense why Muhammad could simply allude to these stories. They're already well known, they're circulating in Arabic before his time. For Sidney Griffith, absence of evidence does mean evidence of absence, and he assumed that there definitely isn't any sort of Bible in Arabic before Islam. Though he also makes the assumption, which is very common, unfortunately, for those who don't work with pre-Islamic Arabic, that Arabic only arose in Arabia. And in his view, the backwardness of Arabia makes it more plausible that there was no written tradition. Leaving aside whether this is valid or not, and I would argue that it's not valid, just consider the amount of space the Quran gives to writing, it should be pointed out that almost all of our physical evidence for Arabic in the 6th century comes not from Arabia, but from Syria, Palestine. There's a very beautiful lintel of a church that survives about 30 miles south of Damascus. Well, I hope it still survives. It's in Greek and Arabic, dated to 567 AD, put up there, as the author says, by one Sharahil ibn Zalim. He's obviously a member of the Arabic-speaking Christian provincial elite that's made it, basically, in the Roman Empire. And they're now upper echelons, and they do what anyone does if they're becoming a member of the more higher up Roman elite. You build. You pay for nice fancy buildings, probably still the same today. You get your name put up there. You have your own message. Arabic was important enough to him that he wanted to make sure Arabic was up there, not just Greek, the language of the empire, but also his own language. And he puts it first. The Arabic is primary in the text. It takes up much more of the space than the Greek. So it's a changing world in which Arabic is actually participating in the provinces of Roman Arabia and Syria, Phoenicia. It's in Syria, Palestine that we find these sort of Arabophone elite using Arabic phrases in documents and commissioning inscriptions in Arabic. And it's in the same region that we find the earliest biblical texts in Arabic. For example, we have bits of a psalm text from the 5th century. Given that Christianity had also become entrenched in Yemen during the 6th century, Muhammad's central West Arabia would have been exposed to Christian currents passing between southwest Arabia and the Levant. In short, it seems very likely that a monotheist vocabulary and a monotheist corpus of literature had begun to be developed in Arabic across the Levant, West Arabia region, in the century or so before Muhammad, via interaction with other Christian traditions. This Arabic religious vocabulary very likely evolved in dialogue with Aramaic speakers and Aramaic texts, in particular with the Peshitta Bible, which was the most authoritative version of the Christian scripture in the Aramaic-speaking lands of the Near East in the 6th century, and which, I would argue, was translated into Arabic in the period shortly before Muhammad. This idea has always been strongly resisted, particularly by Sidney Griffith, but to my mind the Quran assumes such a Christian Arabic forlager. The advanced form of the Quran's polemic, both in terms of language and arguments, make it impossible that Muhammad could have been entirely dependent on later explications. That's a quote from a scholar called Sepala, from Syriac to Arabic. Moreover, a careful analysis of verses in the Quran that draw upon biblical citations often give hints that they are more likely than not based on an Arabic translation of the Syriac Bible. For example, the verse occurs a couple of times in Quran 24:31 about believing women not stamping their feet, so as to give knowledge of the kind of jewelry that they've got on their ankles and their ears, is actually a good translation of Isaiah 3:16, which says that the women of Zion should not, walk and trip along with their feet tinkling from their ankle rings as they go. And it suggests that the Quran is here translating from the Peshitta Bible. I like to think that if we follow this line, we could open up a whole new avenue of research, namely the reconstruction of pre-Islamic theological discourse in Arabic. But I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Robert. And now we move to Professor Stephen Shoemaker from the University of Oregon. The title is Jewish Christianity, Non-Trinitarianism, and the Beginnings of Islam. Stephen Shoemaker is professor of religious studies at the University of Oregon and a specialist on the history of Christianity and the beginnings of Islam. His primary interests are in the religious history of the Eastern Mediterranean world during late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. His research focuses particularly on early devotion to the Virgin Mary, Christian apocryphal literature, and Islamic origins. Professor Shoemaker is the author of The Death of a Prophet, The End of Muhammad's Life and the Beginnings of Islam, a study of the historical Muhammad that focuses on traditions about the end of his life. Professor Shoemaker, you have the word.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I was a little skeptical at first. I'm not a Jewish Christian believer, as you'll see very quickly. And I also thought I had about 30 minutes to speak, and I'm not very good at abbreviating on the fly, but I'm going to do my best to bring us in on time. So, the term Jewish Christianity and its various derivatives, such as Jewish Christian or Judeo-Christian, are vague, outdated terms that should be abandoned in the study of ancient Christianity, not to mention early Islam. Although such terms were very much in vogue in the scholarship of the 19th and 20th century, the discipline of early Christian studies has evolved to a point where such language has now become increasingly unhelpful and even misleading. Indeed, Jewish Christianity was always, at best, a slippery category that invited much scholarly speculation and often unwarranted credulity in the reports of ancient Christian heresiologists. Yet more importantly, what is really at stake in the early Christian debates that generated the conceptual category of Jewish Christianity is not so much the issue of Jewishness or non-Jewishness, as the name seems to suggest, but rather what kind of Judaism a particular religious community decided to follow. There certainly is not a distinctive Jewish Christian theology evident in the ancient church, which one can differentiate from proto-Orthodox or Gentile Christian ideas, as some previous scholars were wont to imagine. Indeed, if one were to define Jewish Christianity as early Christians who utilized Jewish concepts and categories and/or were ethnically Jewish, as some have suggested, then one must surely include Paul as a prime example of a Jewish Christian. Yet Paul is traditionally identified as the font of the Gentile church and the nemesis of early Jewish Christianity. What distinguished Paul and the other so-called Gentile Christians from quote-unquote Jewish Christians was neither their ethnic origin nor their use of Jewish religious ideas and symbols. It was instead their view of the law. Certainly there were in the early church Christians who, after confessing Jesus of Nazareth as Lord and Messiah, continued to observe much of the traditional Jewish law. But it does not seem that Gentiles were excluded from these communities, and accordingly their boundaries were not defined by ethnicity. Likewise, there were many Jews who, like Paul, decided that becoming a Christian Jew meant no longer following the full extent of the law. The use of Jewish genres and ideas cannot distinguish Jewish from Gentile Christianity, since these are equally employed by Gentile Christians, as Joan Taylor rightly observes, and I quote her here. Christianity is the child of Judaism. The notion of Christ is a Jewish concept. The Christian God is the Jewish God. The division between what is somehow exclusively Christian and what is Jewish is an impossible one to make in the early church. Very many types of Jewish thought fed into the diversity of early Christianity. The corpus of the New Testament itself bears witness to a range of Jewish thought, end quote. The main problem then with Jewish Christianity as a historical category is that it effectively obscures the fact that all kinds of early Christianity are ultimately Jewish. Perhaps the implicit bifurcation of Christianity from Judaism offered some unconscious comfort to the European scholars of the 19th and early 20th century who fostered the concept. Yet early Christianity in all its variety remains inescapably a type of Judaism, which we may call Christian Judaism, a religion defined primarily by its confession of Jesus as the Messiah sent by the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Christianity is thus one of the two main forms of Judaism to emerge out of the cauldron of first century Roman Judaism, following the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, the other variety being what we call Rabbinic Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism drew heavily on the traditions of the Pharisees, which it combined with other elements of first century Judaism to realize a new Torah-centered and ethnically defined version of Judaism. Christian Judaism, on the other hand, began as a Jewish movement in Roman Palestine, centered on the messiahship of Jesus, which then spread into the broader Mediterranean world, where it abandoned ethnocentricity and drew heavily on the traditions of Hellenistic Judaism in its embrace of Greco-Roman culture. Both Christian Judaism and Rabbinic Judaism, then, are types of Judaism. And so it makes little sense to imagine a difference between Christians who are somehow Jewish Christians and those who are somehow not Jewish in the early centuries of Christian history. To be sure, there is a divisive debate within early Christianity about the status of the law, and particularly how much of it was to be retained in this new formation. And it was this controversy that gave rise to the scholarly distinction between Jewish and Gentile Christianities in the first place. Yet it is not the case that one sort of Christianity is Jewish while the other is not. Both remain, from the perspective of the history of religions, varieties of Judaism. Instead, the issue in question focused on the degree to which observance of the Jewish law was to be retained. Accordingly, it makes much better sense to me to speak instead of Torah-observant and Torah-relaxing communities within early Christianity, or alternatively, some other sort of similar terminology that focuses squarely on the differences in practice among various early Christians. Such terminology and conceptualization of early Christian diversity likewise mirrors the different positions staked out within Roman Judaism more broadly, as some Jews embraced relaxation of the law while others insisted on its strict observance. Thus, our question becomes, is there any relation between the beginnings of Islam and some Torah-observant form of Christianity? The answer, I think, must be a clear no, particularly since there is no reliable evidence of any Torah-observant Christian communities beyond the end of the 4th century, a point on which there is currently a strong consensus in early Christian studies. I suspect that more generally, the impulse to locate Islam's origins in some sort of Torah-observant form of Christianity initially arose from an older perspective that sought to identify the source of Islam in a single particular sort of religious community from the 6th or early 7th century Arabia. I further suspect that this older model derives, at least in part, from a sort of apologetic interest, which aimed to demonstrate Muhammad's lack of originality by finding the source of his ideas in an Arabian Jewish Christian sect. Yet it no longer seems wise, in my judgment, to continue searching for a single specific origin for the Islamic tradition. Rather, I imagine that a number of different religious beliefs and practices influenced Islam's initial formation, presumably independently of one another, and not from a single source, as I will explain in a moment. The strong imprint of Rabbinic Judaism on earliest Islam seems clear, and there can be little doubt that this derives from significant early contact, indeed overlap, between the community of the believers and late ancient Judaism, as is well known from the Constitution of Medina, among other sources. We do not need to invent a Jewish Christian group to explain these Jewish features. They could just as easily, and in fact more probably, I think, have come directly from Rabbinic and other forms of early Judaism. Presumably, the Qur'an's embrace of many Christian traditions alongside a rejection of Christian Trinitarianism led earlier scholars to search for some sort of Jewish Christian origin. According to several early Christian heresiologists, many Torah-observant Christian groups similarly embraced a low Christology, such as we find in the Qur'an. For instance, the Ebionites, an early Christian group known almost exclusively from their opponents, are famous for their alleged rejection of Jesus' divinity and their insistence on observance of the Torah. Such a combination seems ready-made for understanding the Qur'an's combination of Jewish and Christian traditions alongside a certain respect for the law and for Jesus, who is esteemed as one of God's prophets but not divine. Nevertheless, there is little chance that the Ebionites, or any Torah-observant Christian group for that matter, survived until the 7th century, let alone in the Hijaz. Since we do not need a Torah-observant group of Christians to explain the Qur'an's interest in the law, which I think came through the influence of other non-Christian strains of Judaism, We accordingly should desist in the search for a Jewish Christian origin, either for the Qur'an or for Islam more generally. The issue of the Qur'an's non-Trinitarianism remains an interesting phenomenon, however. And how to explain its confession of Jesus as the Messiah born of a virgin while denying his divinity presents a bit of a puzzle in the context of the 6th and 7th century Near Eastern religious culture. Unquestionably, this profession of Jesus as Messiah does not reflect the influence of non-Christian Jews, since this is the very article of faith that marks the primary boundary between these two types of Judaism. Likewise, the Qur'an relates a large number of specifically Christian traditions, so that we must imagine some sort of contact and influence from Christianity. Should we then look for some sort of non-Trinitarian Christianity behind the Qur'an rather than a Torah-observant Christian group? In some respects, this proposal would seem to make more sense. Nevertheless, in the late 6th and early 7th centuries, I am not aware of any evidence for such a group, particularly in Arabia. Outside of the Latin West, where Arianism remained prominent among the Germanic invaders, there is simply no evidence for non-Trinitarian Christianity much beyond the beginning of the 5th century. And we have absolutely no basis for assuming that such a group lies behind the Christian traditions of the Qur'an. Even more problematic, I think, is the total lack of evidence for even the existence of Christianity in the Hijaz during the 6th and early 7th centuries. Although its presence there is routinely presumed, no doubt, primarily on the basis of the Qur'an and the tradition of its composition in Mecca and Medina, this assumption is nonetheless otherwise unfounded, so far as I have yet seen. It may be that someday such evidence will emerge, but for the present, it remains lacking. Christianity, it is true, had literally encircled the Hijaz by Muhammad's lifetime, but there is no indication of a Christian community, either at Mecca or Medina. While scholars of Near Eastern Christianity routinely assert that Christianity had penetrated the Hijaz by the 7th century, this again seems to be largely assumed on the basis of the Qur'an and later Islamic source materials. Yet even taking these early Islamic reports more or less at face value, they still afford no evidence of a Christian community in Mecca and Medina, but only anecdotes concerning a few individual converts. Indeed, it is rather telling that, as John Wansbrough observes, any Christian characters appearing in the narratives of Islamic origins are, I quote, always from outside the Hijaz, and their introduction is always gratuitous and their alleged place of origin suspect, end quote. Perhaps then one might propose to find some sort of non-Trinitarian Christianity in Ethiopia or South Arabia that can explain the nature of the Qur'an's Christian traditions. Yet here the evidence is also wanting. While there's certainly evidence for Christianity in both locations, there's simply no hint of anti-Trinitarianism, particularly at this late date. In fact, we actually have correspondence from the Arian Roman Emperor, Constantius II, to King Izana of Aksum, expressing dismay that the latter had erroneously converted to a form of Christianity that professed Christ's divinity. This is in the 4th century. It seems improbable, then, to posit that the Qur'an's Christian culture reflects some renegade group of non-Trinitarians hiding out somewhere along the Red Sea. To be sure, it would not be entirely impossible that such a group existed, but given the evidence that we do have about Christianity in this broader region, it is highly unlikely, and nothing invites us to suppose the existence of non-Trinitarian Christianity in these locations, other than pure speculation based on an interest to explain the Qur'an. Indeed, Volume 2, Part 4 of Alois Grillmeyer's magisterial work, Christ and the Christian Tradition, the subtitle is The Church of Alexandria with Nubia and Ethiopia after 451, demonstrates to my mind beyond any doubt that the Church of Ethiopia in late antiquity was thoroughly Trinitarian in its theology, and this, I think, should lay this old chestnut to rest. Quite recently, however, Christian Julien Robin has drawn attention to 3 South Arabian inscriptions from the reign of Abraha, which he alleges show signs of a move away from a Trinitarian understanding of Jesus toward Christological beliefs more in line with, as he names them, Judeo-Christians. Robin's proposed interpretation of these inscriptions is nevertheless extremely problematic and unfortunately shows some basic misunderstandings of Christian theological discourse as it had become established already for centuries before the rule of Abraha. Robin observes that in the sole surviving inscription from Abraha's predecessor, a South Arabian ruler named Sumuyafa, who had been appointed by the Ethiopian king Caleb around 530, Jesus is named differently from the inscriptions established by Abraha after him. In Sumuyafa's inscription, Jesus appears along with Rahmanan, the South Arabian name for God, as his son Christ. According to Robin, this inscription reflects, and I quote, the official doctrine of Aksum's church, particularly since as a fresh convert just baptized, the king presumably would have little to say in matters of doctrine, end quote. Under Abraha, however, who followed, we find 3 inscriptions in which Jesus is named with Rahmanan as his Messiah, omitting any reference to his sonship, and using a Syriac word rather than a Greek calque to name him anointed. Robin concludes that this difference indicates a deliberate and systematic departure from the Christology reflected in Sumuyafa's earlier Aksumite inscription. Following his successful revolt against Ethiopia's agent in South Arabia, Abraha introduced some noteworthy changes to the Christology of the Himyarite church, Robin maintains, so that Jesus would be called Messiah, but not designated as Son. According to Robin, this change reflects a compromise aimed at the powerful Jewish influence among the elites of Himyar. The result is a Judeo-Christian Christology promulgated by Abraha that corresponds nicely with the Qur'an's rejection of Christ's divine sonship, or so Robin proposes. This hypothesis is problematic on a number of fronts. In the first place, one might note the rather small sample size for such a wide range, on which such wide-ranging conclusions rest. But the decision to name Jesus as Messiah rather than Christ is hardly of doctrinal significance, particularly in a Semitic context. The words mean the same thing, anointed. And while the preference for one over the other perhaps says something about the prestige of different languages, theoretically there's no difference. To confess Jesus as Christ in the 6th century, as all of these inscriptions do, is effectively to acknowledge his status as divine and as Lord. By this time, in these contexts, the Christology of all the churches of the late ancient Near East ensured that to call Jesus Christ was to name him also as God. Likewise, the absence of the title Son from Abraha's 3 inscriptions is of little to no significance. On the one hand, all Christians who were using any of the canonical writings of the New Testament, which had become fairly well established by this point, would simply have to accept the language and status of Jesus' sonship. Indeed, I am hard-pressed to think of any early Christian group, non-Trinitarian or otherwise, that rejected the title of Son for Jesus. Only its meaning was disputed. If we are then to imagine a group in 6th century South Arabia that deliberately rejected this title, then we must also suppose that they had an entirely different set of scriptures, which seems highly improbable given what we otherwise know about Himyarite Christianity in this era. And as others have noted before me, the evidence seems to favor the ascendancy of Miaphysite Christianity there, with a particular influx of Julianist Monophysites who fled from the Roman Empire after their position fell out of favor. On the other hand, Robin seems to miss the point that simply calling Jesus Son or even Son of God is not the same as identifying him with Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as in Orthodox Trinitarian thought. Quite to the contrary. There were innumerable Christians in the ancient church who would confess Jesus as Son of God, even as they simultaneously denied his divinity or equality with Yahweh. Jesus' sonship was inescapably determined by the 4 canonical Gospels, among other early Christian writings. So Arius and other non-Trinitarians, for instance, had no problem with the language of sonship. Indeed, in their view, sonship seemed to indicate both difference from and inferiority to God the Father. Therefore, these inscriptions are in fact a red herring, and in no way should they be seen as offering any evidence for either non-Trinitarian or Torah-observant Christianity in South Arabia during the mid-6th century. The evidence for both remains wanting. Thus, any persuasive solution to understanding the Qur'an's rejection of Christ's divinity will unfortunately not come very easily, I suspect. By the time Muhammad's religious movement began to take shape, there had not been any sort of Christianity that rejected Christ's divinity in the Near East for roughly 2 centuries, and even longer for Torah-observant forms of Christianity. Likewise, there remains the issue that there is no evidence of any significant Christian presence in the Hijaz prior to Muhammad's new religious movement. The source of the Qur'an's Christian traditions, including especially its opinions on Jesus' relation to the divinity, remains an enigma. Nevertheless, I think something like Fred Donner's model of Muhammad's religious movement as a community of various monotheistic believers holds the most promise for comprehending these traditions, as well as many other puzzling questions regarding the formation of Islam. According to Donner, Muhammad and his earliest followers did not initially seek to distinguish themselves as a separate religious confession from others. Rather, they seem to have understood themselves as an interconfessional community of the believers that welcomed Jews and seemingly also Christians to full membership in the community, requiring only a simple profession of faith in God and the last day and a recognition of Muhammad's prophetic leadership. While this hypothesis is not entirely unproblematic, in my opinion, it presents a much more persuasive synthesis of the earliest evidence than either the traditional Islamic accounts or any alternative explanation I've seen. This new religious movement was not, as Donner explains, so much a new and distinct religious confession as it was a monotheistic reform movement committed to advancing personal and communal piety in the face of a swiftly approaching final judgment. Yet perhaps the most problematic aspect of Donner's hypothesis is how to explain the inclusion of Christians within the community of the believers in light of the Qur'an's polemics against the Christian doctrines of the Trinity and Christ's divinity. Such pronouncements would seem to preclude any Christian participation in Muhammad's early religious movement, since, as just noted, the doctrines of the triune God and Christ's divinity were well established by the early 7th century. Indeed, any Christians that Muhammad and his early followers encountered would have been overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, Trinitarian. How then are the Qur'an's occasional polemics against the Trinity to be reconciled with this view of the early community? Donner suggests that perhaps such theological tensions could have been overlooked during the early history of the community, as these differences were pushed aside in favor of emphasis on the core themes of the impending last day, faith in the God of Abraham, and a call to piety. As the movement evolved, however, I quote from him, "It was precisely the theological implications of such passages as these in the Quranic texts that made inevitable the eventual crystallization of Muslims as a religious confession distinct from other monotheisms," end quote. Furthermore, prior to the establishment and dissemination of the standardized Quranic text, Donner maintains that Muslims actually knew very little of what was in the Quran, which could perhaps explain the apparent tension between these Quranic passages and the more open boundaries of the early community. This is all the more understandable if the Quranic text was not fixed until somewhat later than the Islamic tradition maintains, perhaps as late as the reign of Abd al-Malik, a view that Donner himself has increasingly come to embrace. In this case, these anti-Christian polemics would reflect the early community's evolving identity into a distinct religious confession, separate from Judaism and Christianity, which seems to have taken place especially during Abd al-Malik's reign. In this case, the divinity of Jesus may not have initially been a deal breaker, as it were, in the earliest history of Muhammad's movement. Only as the community gradually evolved into a distinctively Islamic confession of faith did this doctrine emerge as a primary boundary between Christianity and Muhammad's new revelation of monotheism. Indeed, the emphasis on Muhammad's unique status among the prophets also seems to be a later development, not present in the Quran, which seems to regard all prophets as equals. If then we envision a group of monotheists, Jews, Christians, and Arabs, gathered together initially under the banner of Muhammad's preaching of God in the last day, it is easy to imagine how the doctrines of the Trinity and the divinity of Jesus could over time have become contentious issues, especially between Jewish and Christian members of the community. It would appear that in this case, the momentum was, for whatever reason, ultimately in favor of a lower Christology, which I suspect must have been more palatable to the majority of the movement's members. Jesus, his messiahship, his miraculous birth, and other Christian traditions were less problematic, and so could all be retained. The Trinity and Christ's divinity, however, were proscribed because they chafed against the monotheism that was so central to the group's identity. Still, Christ's presence in other aspects of the Islamic tradition, including eschatology, mysticism, and reverence for his mother, for instance, reflect what was clearly a significant contribution to the formation of the community of the believers. Thus, I think that we should not look for anti-Trinitarianism or a rejection of Christ's divinity at the beginnings of Muhammad's movement. Instead, I think we should see these positions as products of the sectarian milieu within which Islam was forming its confessional identity. These were not positions that Muhammad or the Quran took from some shadowy, historically improbable group of Jewish Christians hiding somewhere in the Hijaz. Rather, the Qur'an's Christology emerged from the mixture of monotheisms shared among the early believers. As the community moved to exclude belief in Christ's divinity and a triune God, Christian believers must have faced a choice. Either break with Muhammad's community in favor of the Christian faith, or adjust their beliefs about Jesus according to the evolving nature of the new faith that they had embraced. I more than suspect that many Christian believers may have opted for the latter option. In the face of eschatological conviction and political turmoil, one can easily imagine their willingness to believe that God had raised up anew a prophet for these troubling times. Indeed, the fact that Christians over the centuries have in large numbers abandoned faith in Christ's divinity in favor of Muhammad's teaching and the Qur'an shows that this would certainly not be unexpected. And all the more so in order that these believers might remain a part of Muhammad's eschatological community of the righteous in order to meet what they believed was the quickly approaching judgment of the hour. I thank you very much.